Hi everyone, it's time for the third part of the series dealing with the box of processors that I foolishly bid on. This episode took me much longer than I expected. The number of processors overwhelmed me a bit because I had to straighten the pins on almost all of them. In addition, I decided to do more with them than just test if they were working, and as usual, I underestimated how much time it would take me. Apart from that, I also had a week-long break because I went to Stockholm for Unreal Fest. There I saw some completely unexpected uses for Unreal Engine, as well as some very strange fountain. Yeah, I totally recommend it, but let's get back to the topic at hand. In this episode, I will focus on the Socket 370 Pentium IIIs and Socket 478 Pentium IVs. To get things done, I have those two nice motherboards. The one on the right is the Asus P4P800, a very decent motherboard with an Intel 865PE chipset that can handle any Socket 478 CPU. The other one is Soltech SL3R I bought it exactly for this episode because I didn't have anything that would work with the Tualatins. Buying such things in a hurry usually leads to overpaying, and that is what happened to me. My Model AM4 motherboard could probably be bought cheaper, but hey, people have done worse things for their online content, right? Okay, everything's set. Time to brew a jug of strong coffee and do some honest work that no one asked for. Again, I use my trusty Debian SSD for the stress test, but with the Pentium III it wasn't the smartest idea. Celerons below 1 GHz took over 3 minutes to boot and the operating system was painfully slow. That is probably as low as I can go in megahertz with this testing method before I lose my sanity. Another annoying thing were the multiplier settings. There was no auto detection, so I sorted everything nicely by multipliers. Then I manually adjusted the switches for each pile. And right at the last pile I remembered that Pentium III processors have factory locked multipliers and these switches are irrelevant. Fantastic! Okay, Pentium IIIs are ready. Time to change the motherboard. Yeah, I know it supports dual channel RAM, but I don't have a 2 matching DDR1 sticks on hand. It will work. This time there are no jumpers at all, and again I could recklessly put a cooler on top of the CPU just like with Socket 775. This should speed things up. And by the way, this motherboard's AI series splash screen is probably even better marketing gimmick today than it was back then. Okay, I'm done. Looks like I have an overwhelming amount of Coppermines and a couple of Tualatins to play with. Nice. Those you are seeing right now didn't make it. The top row is missing some crucial pins. The others won't start or are just unstable. The Pentium IVs are in a similar situation. Some of them had so many pins ripped off that I didn't even bother straightening them, and only 2 of them failed the stability test. So it looks like I have both Williamets, Northwoods and Prescotts, all 3 generations of the socket 478 Pentium IVs. This means that in this episode I will be able to tell you some interesting stories about Intel's struggles with the Pentium IV and also bring back some memories. Let's go! I remember loving those computer magazines and all the benchmarks they had. At the time I thought it would be cool to work there and create these tables by myself. Well, I believe it's now or never. I don't have all the possible clocks here, but there should be enough to show something that might be interesting. For my tests, I will be using the same thing people were using back then. Quake III Arena. Its software's masterpiece focused solely on multiplayer, a very bold move for the time. It delivered both superior graphics and polished gameplay. Quake 3 was also the gold standard for benchmarks as it scaled well, has repeatable results and was suitable for testing both CPU and GPU. And since I'm reaching for Quake 3, I can't forget about its biggest rival, Unreal Tournament. Same genre, same premise, totally different game. Quake was built on the solid conservative foundations of its predecessors, which it perfected. Unreal, on the other hand, aimed for something entirely new, offering more unusual weapons, entirely new game modes, built-in gameplay modifiers, and large imaginative maps. Not everything here was gameplay-wise, but the overall experience is still a work of art. When we basically only had deathmatch and capture the flag modes, Unreal gave us assault mode and a map where one team jumps onto a speeding train out of a helicopter while the other one tries to defend it. Good times, thank you Epic. However, when it came to benchmarks, Unreal wasn't a good choice. It didn't handle GPU testing well and didn't have bundled benchmark demos. Still, it will be handy in today's scenario. Both games are absolutely fantastic and I spent many hours in them, but yeah, it was over 20 years ago. Okay, now to the procedure. For Quake 3 I will use the built-in demo code 4 and read the average frame rate from the console. For Unreal Tournament I will be using the UT-Bench demo available online. The console provides more data here, but I will stick to the average frame rate again. Both games will run at 1280 by 720 using my favorite GeForce 4 Ti 4200. Okay, let's finally do some testing. First up, I will tackle the Coppermine Celerons. To present the results in clear form, I have prepared this neat diagram. The y-axis shows the average frame rate and the x-axis shows the CPU clock in megahertz. So what about these Coppermine Celerons? No surprises, even the slowest one, 566 MHz with 66 MHz system clock will do just fine in Quake 3. As you can see, frame rate scales up nicely with CPU speed and 100 MHz system clock is totally worth it. With nearly the same CPU clock, it gives around 20% boost. In Unreal, situation looks quite similar, although frame rates are lower. Not that Unreal has higher system requirements than Quake, it is quite the opposite in fact. However, this particular demo seems to be more demanding. By the way, fun fact, you could totally have a CPU running at 566 MHz. You could also have it at 766 MHz. However, if all you wanted was 666 MHz, for some unholy reason you get 667 MHz instead. What the hell, Intel? Okay, now let's check the regular Coppermine Pentium IIIs. Again, no surprise. They are faster than Celerons and also scale well. They came in two flavors, with a 100 MHz on 133 MHz system clock. Obviously, the latter ones are better, but required newer motherboards and faster memory, which significantly increased build price. In Unreal, the results are a bit wonky, but they tell the same story. Okay, so all at once we have hit the Coppermine clock limit, the magical 1 GHz barrier, and the year 2000. The year 2000 was when the Pentium IV came into play, but let's forget about it for a moment and move on to the year 2001. The Pentium IV was not warmly received, to say the least. AMD was conquering the market with its Athlon, and OEM manufacturers were reluctant to switch to the new platform. Intel therefore introduced Tualatin, an improved Pentium III, to fill the niche, but at the same time made sure that it remained in that niche. Tualatin was intentionally incompatible with existing motherboards and its supply was very limited. Few people actually had it, so its performance became the stuff of legend. Let's check it out on the chart. Tualatin Celerons performs really well. Clock for clock they give 24% boost. Very impressive. However, in the case of regular Pentium IIIs with a 20% faster clock than Coppermine, they offer a 20% boost. It doesn't sound like legendary performance if you ask me. Shame I got only one of them. Unreal confirms the Celeron's performance, but for the regular P3 it's even worse, with only 7% gain. However, such a poor result might have something with the VIA chipset. No one ever said that the 133 series were good chipsets, but I didn't expect it to be so problematic. It worked very well and stably under Debian, and memtest also showed no hardware problems. However, as soon as it got its drivers under Windows XP, it started to go crazy. Random slowdowns, recovery after serious failure reports, you name it. The direct 3D renderer was so unstable that I had to switch to OpenGL in Unreal Tournament. I finally got the situation under control, but I'm not entirely confident that the motherboard is performing at its best in terms of performance. Shame. If I ever manage to get my hands on a motherboard for Tualatin but with a Intel chipset instead, I will repeat these tests and make a short about it. For now though, that's enough Pentium III benchmarks for today. Now it's time to deal with Pentium IV. However, I won't go back to the year 2000 because the ones I have are not designed for the socket 423. They looked like this, but sadly there was nothing like that in the package I bought. The ones I have are for the socket 478, but they have the same Willamette core, so the difference doesn't matter. One more thing though, take a look at the launch prices of the Pentium IVs listed on Wikipedia. In November 2000 the 1.5 GHz model cost over $800. Less than a year later, in July 2001, the 1.6 GHz model dropped below $300. The one I have here today is from late August 2001 and cost only $163. What was the reason for such a brutal price reduction? Well, let's look at my performance chart. First, the Celerons. With these clock speeds you might have expected something more, but Celerons are Celerons, they are not meant to shine in terms of performance. So let's look at the regular Pentium IV. With a 400 MHz advantage over Tualatin we get less than 5% performance gain. Something seems to be wrong here. Okay, so how does it look in Unreal then? Oh, not only does the Pentium IV score worse than the Tualatin, but it also gets beaten by the Coppermine. Yes, the performance of the first Pentium IVs was a disaster. If Intel hadn't made the Tualatins require a dedicated motherboard, the Pentium IV probably wouldn't have sold at all. And to add insult to injury, think about this. Those were the days when clock speed was almost synonymous with performance. The tested model has 1.6 GHz, but Pentium 4 started at 1.3 GHz. I tested my Pentium 4 on a much more modern motherboard with faster memory than the one for the Pentium 3. And until the arrival of Pentium 4, each successive generation of Intel processor left its predecessor behind. Customers were very dissatisfied, and the fact that early Pentium 4 chipsets required the use of expensive RAM bus memory did not help either. Okay, so what went wrong that caused such poor performance? The source of Pentium 4's problem was its newly introduced microarchitecture. With this generation, Intel decided to retire its P6 microarchitecture, which was born with the Pentium Pro in 1995. In its place, it introduced the NetBurst architecture, which powered all the Pentium 4 models. Does this mean that NetBurst was simply inferior to P6? Well, yes and no. It's complicated, but I'll try to explain it as simply as possible. Okay, let's start with some absolute basics. In this diagram, I have a very simplified processor system that is a CPU in the middle and connected to it a RAM, a graphics card, mass storage and peripherals such as pointing devices. This is how almost every computer is built, and each of them can do what it does because the processor executes the instructions intended for it. These instructions are the basic building blocks of our applications. The list of possible instructions for a given processor is always predetermined and includes things such as adding two numbers, comparing them, or loading data from memory. Of course, instructions are also responsible for the processor's interaction with other computer components. Pentium 3 and 4 are the same x86 family, which means they execute the same instructions with the same results. However, they have a different microarchitectures, which means that their internal circuits are arranged completely differently, even though they do the same thing. And so we come to our first problem with Pentium 4. Both processors have a so-called pipeline inside them, which is a kind of production line that processes incoming instructions. While Pentium 3 had a pipeline consisting of 10 stages, the Pentium 4 had 20. Instructions in the Pentium 4 required more clock ticks to go through the entire pipeline and thus be executed. Of course, this is a huge simplification. The pipeline is not a straight line and different instructions take different paths, but the conclusion is the same. With the same number of clock ticks, the Pentium 3 will execute more instructions. This can be seen in my charts when the 400 MHz advantage did little for performance. But that's not all yet. From the very beginning, the most important feature of computers has been their ability to check logical conditions and execute a different instruction path based on those conditions. For example, the game periodically checks whatever the player health has dropped to 0 and triggers a death sequence if it has. This type of logical condition checking occurs frequently in programs and often requires additional information to be fetched from memory, which takes a lot of time. To optimize this, processors use a technique called speculative execution. While waiting for the data necessary to make a decision, the processor tries to guess what the result will be and begins to execute the tasks from the appropriate path. If the incoming data confirms the decision, several instructions are already executed. However, if it was wrong, it is not a problem either, as the completed tasks are simply discarded and the processor switches to the correct path. This is transparent to the user unless it happens too often, causing a performance hit. And here we come to the second weakness of Pentium 4. While it generally did a better job of predicting the path than its predecessor, its mispredictions were much more costly. After each mistake, the processor had to clear its pipeline, and with more stages, this simply took longer. And we see this in the difference between Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament. From what I understand, the Quake 3 code was definitely kinder to the prediction mechanism in the Pentium 4. This has nothing to do with the quality of programming. In Unreal Tournament, the shortcomings of the Pentium 4 are simply more noticeable. For most games, the results fell somewhere between those two. Well, okay, we already know that a long pipeline has its drawbacks, but Intel must have known that too. So why did they design the Pentium 4 this way? There were more stages in Pentium 4, but they were smaller and better suited for high clock frequencies. And that was Intel's plan, to compensate for the shortcomings with higher speed and outpace the competition by many gigahertz. According to their announcement at the time, they intended to reach 10 GHz somewhere between 2005 and 2007. Well, 20 years later we still don't have 10 GHz processors, but more on that in a moment. For now it's time for the successor to Willamette, the Northwood. Intel learned its lesson and did a lot to get rid of the bad taste left after the launch of Pentium 4. The L2 cache was doubled and expensive RAM bus memory was ditched in favor of SDRAM and DDRs. However, the most important change was the transition of the production process from 180 to 130 nanometers. Thanks to this, Northwood ran cooler, could achieve much higher clock speeds and was also perfect for overclocking. Let's see how it looks on my chart. Quite good, the 200 FPS mark has been broken, hooray! However, if you look more closely, the Northwood 1.8 is not much more efficient than the Willamette 1.6. This doesn't matter though, because the rapid increase in clock speed means that comparing it to the Pentium 3 no longer makes sense. It's similar in Unreal Tournament. Here, however, the performance increase begins to flatten out because the original OpenGL renderer has a hard limit of 60 FPS. In just 2 years, Northwood reached 3.4 GHz. NetBurst processors lost out to the competition clock for clock, but thanks to the huge increase in clock speed, they simply outran everyone. So it seemed that there was method in this madness. Northwood's successor was Prescott, and everyone expected a lot from it. Intel did switch to a 90 nanometer process, but at the same time increased the pipeline depth from 20 to 31 steps in order to continue marching towards 10 GHz. How did it turn out? Let's look at my chart. Well, as you can see, it wasn't too bad. Despite everything I've shown, the increased pipeline depth didn't ruin performance. Celerons have clearly improved and full Pentium 4 seems to be even slightly better than Northwood's. This time NetBurst problems surfaced elsewhere. The longer pipeline made Prescott's guzzled amps like crazy, heating up terribly in the process. For this reason, the community gave them the nickname Prescott. Take a look at this 3D Mark 2001 comparison between a 3 GHz Northwood and a Prescott. I had to make sure to thoroughly smear the entire Prescott with thermal paste, otherwise it would go into thermal throttling. It was therefore necessary to provide better cooling and a more powerful PSU, but this wasn't so obvious at the time. Many machines still resemble their ancestors, beige boxes with ribbon cables everywhere and a weak power supply fan as the only means of ventilation for the case. The world simply wasn't ready for it. The power consumption of Prescott's reached 115 watts, which doesn't seem like that much until you realize that this was a consumption of a single core. And as for the promised 10 GHz, things didn't go well here either. Despite all sacrifices, only 3.8 GHz was achieved. What happened? Well, it's no coincidence that the graph I already showed you reports a flattening out at around 4 GHz. This is where you find a kind of sweet spot between the required voltage, frequency and power consumption. In this range you can get the most performance without going crazy with heat dissipation. The funniest thing, however, is that the laws of physics behind this phenomenon were well understood when Intel announced its 10 GHz goal. Perhaps they were counting on some kind of breakthrough, or maybe the management did not listen carefully enough to their engineers. In my opinion, the most likely version is that Intel itself was surprised by the weakness of NetBurst and put on a brave face. The 10 GHz target made it seem like NetBurst had a bright future, while in the background work was underway on its successor, ironically based on the P6 microarchitecture. The successor was named Core 2, and as I showed you in the previous episode using Crysis, it sent NetBurst to the scrap heap almost overnight. Just in time. At that point even the fastest Pentium 4 couldn't beat a Athlon 64. Okay, I think that's enough about Intel and its processors for today. I hope I managed to present the ups and downs of Pentium 4 in an interesting way. I have one more episode of this series ahead of me where I will play around with Mendocino Celerons and Socket 7 processors. This will conclude the topic of my lucky CPU box, which is great because I already have other interesting topics for videos. So, thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye!